On Sunday night, April 13th, Jennifer Coffindaffer posted 3 words on X that changed the entire conversation around this case. Nancy sadly died. Not a question. Not a theory framed with careful caveats and journalistic hedging. Not the kind of speculative language that commentators use when they want to suggest something without committing to it. 3 words, declarative, from a former FBI special agent who spent 25 years investigating exactly this category of crime. 3 words that represent, as directly as any public statement has in 72 days, what many investigators and analysts have privately believed for weeks, that the window in which Nancy Guthrie could plausibly still be alive closed a long time ago, and that whoever took her from her home in the Catalina foothills on the night of February 1st did not keep her alive long enough for a ransom to be paid. Nancy sadly died. And then Coffendaffer went further. She said the motive was simple, that law enforcement has known it from the beginning. Kidnapping for ransom. That is all. The investigation that has generated 72 days of breaking news, competing theories, drone activity over the crime scene, DNA evidence that cannot currently be read, a sheriff facing removal proceedings, a board of supervisors invoking a rare territorial law, all of it, according to Coffindaffer, traces back to a transaction that went wrong. Someone decided that the mother of a national television anchor was worth money. They took her. They sent ransom notes to news outlets within 24 hours. And when the FBI, following standard protocol in kidnapping for ransom cases, declined to recommend payment without proof of life, something had already happened or was happening to Nancy that made proof of life impossible, and she died. And then, knowing that she was dead, knowing that the transaction had failed, the people who took her kept sending notes, not to negotiate, not to create a path to resolution, to extract whatever emotional response they could from a family that did not know the truth, that could not know the truth, that was forced by that ignorance to keep engaging with communications that had no real content behind them. Coffindaffer called that what it was, torture. The word she used is the right word. Sending ransom notes to a grieving family after the person they are grieving is already dead is not a continuation of a transaction. It is the deliberate, knowing infliction of psychological harm on people who are in the worst possible position, who cannot stop hoping, who cannot stop reaching toward any piece of information that might mean their mother is still alive, who are forced by their love and their uncertainty to treat every note as if it might be real. Day 72. And this is where we are. This is forensic disconnect. And today we are going to do what most coverage of this case has not done. We are going to sit with what Coffindaffer said, take it seriously, examine it carefully, and connect it to everything else that has emerged this week, including a second major development from Coffindaffer that has received almost no attention in mainstream coverage. A theory about the ransom notes themselves, about what was written in them, about why Savannah Guthrie, in every public video message to her mother's kidnapper, used language that was specifically and deliberately religious, and what that tells us about what may have been in the notes that law enforcement has never made public. 2 developments from Coffindaffer this week, 3 words that say Nancy is dead, and a theory about scripture in the ransom notes that reframes everything we thought we understood about the communications in this case. Before we go further, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We are 72 days into a case that is at an inflection point. The forensic picture is developing. The institutional accountability deadline is 7 days away. The expert commentary this week has been harder and more direct than anything said publicly in the first 10 weeks. Subscribe, because the next 7 days, between now and April 21st, when Nanos must respond to the board under oath, are going to be among the most consequential in this investigation. Now, let's start with who Jennifer Coffindaffer is and why what she says matters in a way that most public commentary on this case does not. Coffindaffer spent 25 years as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She investigated violent crime, kidnapping, extortion, and the specific behavioral and forensic patterns that characterize ransom-driven abductions. When she talks about how kidnapping for ransom cases unfold, how the notes are structured, how the demands are made, how investigators respond, what happens when ransom is not paid, she is not drawing on academic knowledge or general criminological theory. She is drawing on operational experience with the exact category of crime that is at the center of this case. She has been in rooms with kidnapping victims and their families. She has been in rooms with people who kidnapped for money. She knows what this looks like from the inside. She has been one of the most consistent and credentialed voices commenting on this case since February. She was the agent who said that the ransom notes sent to TMZ in April were timed to coincide with Savannah's return to the Today Show. Not by accident, she said, but deliberately, to cause maximum pain at a moment of maximum vulnerability. She was the agent who introduced the concept of tickling the wire, the federal law enforcement tactic of sending a partial Bitcoin payment to the ransom wallet to trace where the money goes, to see whether the person who created the wallet is reachable through the blockchain. She has been specific, operational, and careful in everything she has said about this case, which is why Sunday night's post matters the way it does. Coffindaffer does not throw words around. When she says Nancy sadly died, she is not speculating carelessly. She is sharing an assessment grounded in her understanding of how kidnapping for ransom cases work, in what the evidence in this case shows, and in what law enforcement sources have told her about where the investigation stands. Her post on Sunday structured the case with a specific timeline. February 1st, the abduction. February 2nd, a ransom note to local media outlets in Tucson. February 3rd, a ransom note to TMZ. The timeline she presented is not speculation. It is the documented record of what happened in the first 48 hours after Nancy was taken. And then, after establishing that timeline, she delivered her conclusion: kidnapping for ransom. Nancy sadly died. The kidnappers didn't care and tortured the family with 2 notes, knowing the FBI would not recommend paying a ransom without proof of life. That last clause is important. Knowing the FBI would not recommend paying without proof of life. This is not a detail that a casual observer would know. This is operational knowledge about FBI protocol in kidnapping for ransom cases, about the specific reason that the family's public pleas took the form they did, about why Savannah's video messages to the kidnapper emphasized faith and conscience and the possibility of doing the right thing rather than payment or negotiation. The FBI, in ransom cases, does not encourage families to simply pay. The FBI encourages families to demand proof of life before any financial discussion, because proof of life is the only thing that confirms the person you are paying to recover is actually alive to be recovered. If the kidnapper cannot provide proof of life, if Nancy had already died before the ransom notes were even sent, or died shortly afterward while the notes were being prepared, then the entire framework of the FBI's standard approach to ransom cases collapsed. There was no proof of life to demand. There was nothing to negotiate. The notes were sent into a vacuum, into a process that could not produce the outcome it was designed to produce, into a family that was responding to communications from people who no longer had what the family needed, and the kidnappers knew that. They knew, Coffendaffer argues, that the FBI protocol would prevent payment without proof of life that they could not provide. And they sent the notes anyway, because at that point, the money may have been secondary. At that point, the act of sending the notes had become the objective in itself. The torture was the product. Coffindaffer framed her analysis through Occam's razor, the problem-solving principle that among competing explanations for a set of facts, the simplest explanation that accounts for all of them is most likely to be correct. She wrote, "Like most cases, this one is simple, but everyone wants to make it complex." That observation, everyone wants to make it complex, is a commentary on how this case has been covered since February. Dozens of theories, contractors and day laborers, ICE connections, a second note theory, the Sonora, Mexico claim, the retaliatory kidnapping theory from Dr. Ann Burgess, the Walmart parking lot theory from Detective Brian Martin, the drone over the scene, the scripture in the notes theory that Coffindaffer herself introduced this week. The case has generated a volume of competing frameworks that can obscure the simplest reading of the available evidence. Coffindaffer's position is that the simplest reading is the correct one. Someone targeted Nancy Guthrie because she was Savannah Guthrie's mother. They took her for money. Nancy died of a medical event, of the stress and physical trauma of the abduction, of the deprivation of the heart medication her pacemaker-dependent cardiovascular system required, possibly within hours of being taken. The transaction failed. The notes continued anyway. And now, 72 days later, investigators are looking not for a living person, but for the people who killed her, and for the place where she is. Now let's talk about the second development from Coffindaffer this week, because this one has received far less coverage than the Nancy sadly died post, and it may ultimately prove to be just as significant. On Monday, April 14th, Coffindaffer raised a question about the ransom notes that reframes something that has been hiding in plain sight since the beginning of this investigation. She was analyzing the language that Savannah Guthrie used in her public video messages to her mother's kidnapper, the videos that Savannah posted on Instagram, and that were broadcast on the Today Show, the messages that were carefully constructed with law enforcement guidance to appeal directly to whoever was holding Nancy. If you remember those videos, you remember that Savannah's language was unmistakably religious. She spoke about faith, about never being too late to do the right thing, about believing in the essential goodness of every human being, about God and hope and the possibility of redemption. The language was specific and deliberate, not the casual religious vocabulary of someone invoking God generally, but the kind of language that speaks to someone with a specific relationship to faith, someone for whom scripture and belief are central rather than peripheral. Coffindaffer had always assumed, she said, that the religious language in Savannah's messages reflected Savannah's own faith. Savannah Guthrie is publicly religious. She has spoken about her Christian faith on the Today Show. The assumption was that she was speaking from her own spiritual framework, reaching toward whoever had her mother with the language that was most natural to her. But then Coffindaffer had a different thought. She said on X in a live stream, what if the decision was made to use religion because scripture was in the note? What if the notes were from someone quoting scripture or referencing scripture, someone who sees themselves as holy? And then she added the investigative principle that makes this question so important. To connect, you must connect with the place the ransom note writer is coming from, not the lens of the respondent. You are just the respondent. You need to relate to what the note writer wrote, not what you would write. And the religious language in Savannah's messages may not have been her own. It may have been a mirror, a response calibrated to the specific psychological and spiritual language of the person who wrote the notes. A way of saying, I hear you. I am speaking your language. I believe what you believe. Come back to us. If that is correct, if the ransom notes contained scripture, if the person who took Nancy was someone for whom religious identity is central, someone who framed the act of kidnapping within a religious or moral framework that made sense to them, that is a significant piece of profiling information. It does not identify a suspect, but it describes a psychology. A person who needed, at some level, to justify what they were doing, in terms that connected to their sense of themselves as a moral being. A person whose communications with the family were not purely transactional, but carried a spiritual dimension that investigators would have recognized and responded to. The public has never seen the full text of the ransom notes that Savannah Guthrie said were real. Law enforcement has not disclosed their contents, but Coffendaffer believes, based on what she knows from her sources and from the pattern of Savannah's responses, that there was something in those notes that was specifically religious, something that told investigators, this person has a specific relationship to faith, something that shaped how the family was coached to respond, something that, if it could be matched to a specific individual's known patterns of communication or belief, could be profiling gold. Now let's place both of Coffindaffer's developments this week, Nancy sadly died and the scripture theory, alongside the assessment of Dr. Burgess, because when you hold all three together, the picture that emerges is more specific than any of them individually. Dr. Burgess spent decades working with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. She is a psychiatric nurse and researcher who helped develop the clinical frameworks for understanding violent criminal behavior, who sat across from serial killers and studied what drove them, who built the profiling methodology that modern criminal investigation relies on. She is the researcher who inspired the Netflix series Mindhunter. Her assessment of the Nancy Guthrie case carries weight that goes beyond commentary. Dr. Burgess said this week on Brian Enton Investigates that she believes something went very wrong inside the house, that the blood on the front step is a signal, not just that Nancy was hurt, but that whatever happened began immediately in the moments of the abduction, before she was taken somewhere else. She believes this was personal, that the question investigators have been asking is who in Nancy's orbit would be hurt most by her disappearance, and she believes that the answer to that question, who would be hurt most, is not random. It points somewhere specific. Now hold Burgess's retaliatory or personal motivation theory alongside Coffindaffer's ransom theory. Are they in contradiction? Not necessarily. A kidnapping can be simultaneously personal and financial. Someone who wants to hurt Savannah Guthrie, who has a grievance against her, who wants to cause her the maximum possible pain, might choose to structure that harm as a ransom demand. Because a ransom demand does something specific that a simple act of violence does not. It prolongs the family's uncertainty. It creates a state of not knowing that is, in some ways, worse than knowing. A ransom demand with no intention of ever releasing the hostage is a machine for generating and sustaining grief. It keeps the family in an extended state of hope and dread that no other action would produce. If the kidnapper had both motivations, personal hatred and financial opportunism, then the ransom notes were doing two jobs simultaneously. They were demanding money that the kidnapper may have genuinely wanted, and they were generating exactly the kind of prolonged, public, visible suffering in Savannah Guthrie that a person with a personal grievance would find satisfying. Both things can be true at once, and the scripture theory adds a third dimension. A person who has a personal grievance against Savannah Guthrie, who is also motivated by money, who also frames their actions within a religious or moral framework that justifies what they are doing, that is a very specific psychological profile. That is not a random criminal who saw an opportunity. That is someone whose worldview includes a framework for why this was justified or even righteous. Someone who may have told themselves a story about why Savannah Guthrie or her family deserved what was happening to them. That kind of person leaves psychological fingerprints. The way they write, the specific scripture they would cite, the moral framework their communications imply. Investigators who have seen the full text of the notes know what those fingerprints look like. The public does not. But Coffindaffer believes they are there, and that they tell investigators something important about who they are looking for. Now let's talk about where the investigation stands institutionally and what the next 7 days look like. The April 21st deadline is real. The Pima County Board of Supervisors gave Sheriff Chris Nanos 10 business days on April 7th to provide sworn answers to 4 specific questions. That deadline falls on April 21st, the same day as the board's next scheduled meeting. Whatever Nanos provides or fails to provide will happen in 7 days. Supervisor Matt Hines has been clear about what the stakes are. A failure to provide a substantive response, not just any response, but a substantive one, could lead the board to declare the office vacant and remove Nanos from his position. That is not a theoretical outcome. It is a mechanism that exists in Arizona statute and that the board has explicitly invoked, and Hines has said he believes the board would be within its legal rights to use it. The 4 questions Nanos must answer cover his employment history at the El Paso Police Department, where he resigned in 1982 rather than face termination after 8 suspensions in 6 years, and where he appears to have misrepresented the circumstances of his departure in multiple official contexts, his disciplinary actions against political opponents within his department, his cooperation with federal immigration authorities, and his department's repeated budget overruns. Those are the formal questions. The informal question, the one that every member of the public watching this case is asking, is whether the institutional failures of the first 33 days under his leadership contributed to whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie. If Nancy is dead, as Coffendaffer believes, as the weight of expert opinion suggests, then that informal question becomes harder and more specific. It becomes, did the 33 days of inadequate investigation give the people who took Nancy time and distance they would not have had if the crime scene had been treated as a kidnapping from the first hour? Did the search and rescue framing, the inexperienced detective, the contaminated crime scene, the failure to immediately treat this as what it was, did those failures cost Nancy her chance of being found in time? Those questions may never have definitive answers. We may never know exactly when Nancy died or whether a faster response would have changed the outcome. But the questions will be asked. They should be asked. And the April 21st deadline is the moment when the institutional accountability for the investigation comes into focus in a formal, sworn, documented way. Now let's talk about the forensic picture. Because even if Nancy is dead, even if the search has transitioned from rescue to recovery to homicide investigation, the forensic tools that have been developing in this case remain relevant and may become more rather than less important. The mixed DNA. The sample from inside Nancy's home that contains genetic material from more than one person, that the FBI's laboratory has been unable to deconvolute because the software that could separate the individual profiles within this specific complex mixture does not yet exist in deployable form. C.C. Moore said that the urgency of this case has accelerated the development of that software, that a company that was planning a later release has moved up its timeline. If Nancy's body is found and a second crime scene is identified, the DNA picture changes entirely. A fresh sample from a new location, collected under different conditions, may not have the complexity of the mixture at the primary scene. A clean profile from the second crime scene, matched against the unresolved profile from the first, would be the forensic breakthrough that everything else has been waiting for. The blockchain. The Bitcoin wallet that was included in the ransom demand, that has remained empty since February, that the FBI has described as one of their best leads in this investigation. The blockchain record is permanent. Whatever transactions have ever been associated with that wallet address, whatever metadata surrounds its creation, wherever the digital infrastructure behind it leads, none of that degrades, none of it disappears. The FBI is following that trail, and it will eventually arrive somewhere. The scripture in the notes. If Coffindaffer is right, if the real notes contain specific religious language, specific scripture citations, a specific moral framework that describes a particular psychological profile, that language exists somewhere in the investigative record. If a suspect is eventually identified through the blockchain or the DNA or a tip, that language becomes corroborating evidence. It connects the person who created the financial infrastructure of the ransom scheme to the person who wrote the notes that Savannah responded to with matching religious language. All of these forensic threads are still active. All of them are still developing. And all of them become more important, not less, if the investigation has transitioned from missing persons to homicide. Because in a homicide investigation, every thread leads toward a courtroom. Every piece of evidence is being built toward a prosecution. And the people who took Nancy Guthrie, whoever they are, wherever they are, whether they are in Tucson or across the border in Sonora or somewhere entirely different, left traces. The blockchain trace is permanent. The DNA trace, once the software exists to read it, is permanent. The psychological fingerprints in the notes are permanent. They left traces, and the investigation will follow them. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old, 5 feet tall, silver hair and blue eyes. She was taken from her home 72 days ago without her shoes and without the medication her heart requires. She raised 3 children alone after their father died. She went door to door with a clipboard for something she believed in. She showed her daughter, by everything she ever was, what faith and strength and quiet resilience look like in the face of a world that does not always cooperate. Her daughter goes on television every morning, in yellow, ready or not. If Coffendaffer is right, if Nancy is gone, then what this investigation needs now is not a rescue. It is a reckoning. The reckoning that comes from finding where she is, finding who took her, building the case that puts them in a courtroom, and making sure that what happened to Nancy Guthrie in the dark of February 1st is accounted for fully and completely. Nancy deserves that reckoning. Her family deserves it, and the people who took her will face it, because the blockchain is permanent, and the DNA is in a laboratory, and the scripture in the notes describes someone specific, and the FBI does not stop. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That is 1-800-225-5324. Submit tips at tipsfbi.gov. Call the Pima County Sheriff's Department at 520-351-4900. The combined reward is over $1 million. Completely anonymous. Hit the like button. Subscribe to Forensic Disconnect. Drop a comment. Do you believe Coffindaffer is right? Is Nancy gone? And what do you think about the scripture theory? Does it change how you understand the ransom notes? We read every single comment. Day 72. Nancy sadly died. We will not stop covering this case until there is an answer.